Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a situation that's, well, unfolded with striking speed and intensity in Los Angeles. We're drawing our understanding from a stack of sources. You've shared reports from The Guardian and a really sharp analysis from Politico.
That's right. And this isn't just, a local news story. It's much more complex. It's a weave of immigration enforcement, civil protests, and frankly, an extraordinary federal response involving military deployment right here on U.S. streets.
Yeah, extraordinary is the word. We're talking about recent actions by ICE in L.A. that triggered significant protests. And then how the federal government reacted by sending in, thousands of National Guard members?
Thousands, yeah. And quite remarkably, hundreds of U.S. Marines as well.
Marines. Okay, that's different.
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really meticulously unpack these sources. We want to trace that chain of events, right? From the initial ICE actions through the escalation.
Exactly. And we need to dig into the very different perspectives. You've got local officials like the mayor and the governor. Then you've got the federal government's stated reasons.
Which seem quite different.
Oh, very different. And then there are the legal experts weighing in on the implications, and crucially, the voices on the ground. The protesters, the observers, the people directly affected.
Yeah, we need to hear this too. Ultimately, we're trying to figure out what this all signifies for that delicate balance, right? Federal-state relations and this really fraught question of using military forces domestically.
Because at its core, this situation isn't just about Los Angeles. It really touches on fundamental, you could say, bedrock questions about the limits of power, the scope of authority, and, the state of civil liberties in the United States today.
Absolutely. It's the kind of situation that forces you to think deeply about the structures of government we often just take for granted.
It does.
Definitely a lot to get through, but it's vital we understand the nuances. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So where does this story really begin, according to the sources? It kicks off the week before these reports came out, right? Like the week of June 2nd, 2025.
That's the starting point, yeah. That's when Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, began conducting these raids in Los Angeles.
And a critical piece of context right from the start. According to LA Mayor Karen Bass, she argues the city itself was peaceful before any of this started.
Right. That's her very strong assertion, that this wasn't some federal response to existing unrest, but actually that the federal action itself created the tension and the fear.
And she's been really vocal about the immediate human impact, hasn't she? She described the raids as inducing a profound level of fear, even terror among residents.
And crucially, she's not just talking about undocumented folks. She explicitly includes legal residents in that assessment, people who are here perfectly legally.
Yeah, the sources highlight a specific example she gave, and it really hits home. Legal residents going for their required annual check-in appointments at ICE facilities.
They're required appointments, yeah.
And then being detained right there.
Exactly. And the mayor pointed out this creates this terrifying dilemma, right? For people who are actively trying to follow the rules, they become scared to show up for their next required check-in.
Because they think they'll just disappear into the system. She used the phrase fall into the closet, I think.
Yeah, her term for basically going into hiding, avoiding contact with authorities because they're scared, and the awful consequence of avoiding those appointments.
They could lose their status.
Precisely. They could fall out of status, lose their legal residency, even though the whole fear spiral started while they were trying to comply. From her perspective, it's a cycle of fear manufactured by the enforcement action itself.
And Mayor Bass really frames this within the identity of LA, doesn't she? She keeps saying Los Angeles is fundamentally a city of immigrants.
Always embrace that, I think she said.
Yeah. So these ICE raids are seen not just as isolated law enforcement, but as something fundamentally at odds with the city's character, its whole relationship with a huge part of this population.
So you've got this immediate, very intense reaction from the city's leader, plus this palpable fear she describes among residents. That seems to be the first domino.
Right. The protests we're really digging into today, the big demonstrations that ultimately drew this massive federal military response, they began directly because of these initial ICE raids.
The sources make that link very clear.
Right.
This wasn't just random unrest bubbling up. It was a specific public reaction to federal immigration actions that the local government and clearly many residents saw as harmful, unwarranted, and really destabilizing.
Okay, so ICE raids, fear, protests erupting, and then comes the federal government's reaction, which is where things really escalate.
Dramatically. This is where it draws national, even international attention.
And the scale of that reaction is just It jumps out immediately from the sources. We're talking about deploying approximately 4,000 members of the National Guard to Los Angeles.
Which is a significant number in itself, absolutely.
But then, the thing that makes this truly exceptional, and it's highlighted again and again in the reports, the addition of roughly 700 U.S. Marines.
Yeah, the Marines, the sources call this an exceptionally rare deployment targeting people domestically. It's really unusual.
Why is it so rare? I mean, the National Guard gets deployed domestically sometimes, right?
Well, the Guard can be federalized and used domestically under certain laws, like the Insurrection Act, although that has its own complexities we'll get into. But deploying active duty federal military branches, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines for domestic law enforcement or crowd control, that runs up against long-standing legal principles, mainly the Posse Comitatus Act.
Posse Comitatus. Okay, we'll need to unpack that.
Definitely. But the key point here is that using Marines on American streets against American civilians is highly, highly unusual and legally sensitive.
And the timeline you mentioned, it underscores how fast this all happened. Reports surfaced about maybe sending Marines.
Yeah, sort of whispers and rumors initially.
And then, bam, within hours, it's confirmed. They're deploying.
It felt very quick, yeah, like a decision made and executed rapidly, not something that involved, lengthy deliberation with state officials, for instance.
And President Trump himself commented on it publicly.
Oh, yes. He made it clear this was his administration's directive. Initially, when asked about Marines, he was a bit coy, saying, "We'll see what happens." But later, he was much more assertive. Quotes like, "Bring in the troops," saying he'd send even more National Guard if we needed it. He actually called the decision to deploy troops a great decision.
So, framing it as decisive action, he personally initiated and strongly supported.
Exactly. And the stated justification from the administration, that came from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth.
What was the official reason given?
Hegseth claimed, according to the sources, that the Marines were necessary because Governor Newsom, California's governor, refuses to defend federal law enforcement officers.
Okay, so they're pinning it on the governor's alleged inaction.
That's the specific justification provided. It positions the federal action as a response to perceived failure or even obstruction from the state government. Like, we had to step in because California wasn't protecting our guys.
Which, as you said, directly contradicts the view from Mayor Bass and likely Governor Newsom, too.
Completely contradicts it. Their view is the federal action was the problem, not the solution. This clash of narratives federal intervention needed due to state failure versus federal intervention manufactured the crisis that's absolutely central to the political and legal fight that erupts.
Right. And that clash brings us squarely to the pushback from California's leaders. Mayor Bass's reaction, as documented, is particularly sharp. It's framed as a fundamental power struggle, isn't it?
Absolutely. Her most significant accusation, the one that really frames the whole local perspective, is that the federal government is using Los Angeles as a test case.
A test case.
Test case and an experiment, she said. An experiment to demonstrate federal willingness and ability to just override or take over authority from state and local government.
That's a really powerful framing, suggesting it's not just about protests, but about asserting federal dominance.
Yeah, she didn't mince words. She called the entire federal intervention completely unwarranted.
And her reasoning was?
Her reasoning was emphatic. Nothing warranted the raids. Nothing was happening in the city before ICE started those actions.
So from her viewpoint, it wasn't a pre-existing crisis needing federal help. It was the federal action itself that created the chaos.
Precisely. She blamed the whole situation directly on chaos that was started in Washington, D.C.
She also questioned the logic, right?
Yeah.
Why bring in Marines if the National Guard are apparently just guarding a couple of buildings?
Yeah, that was another point she made. If the Guard's role is primarily static security at 2 federal locations, why the need for Marines? It implies she saw the Marine deployment as either overkill for the stated mission or perhaps serving some other unstated purpose. Maybe intimidation.
Or part of that test case idea.
Could be. And she had a really clear message for LA residents, too. She urged them, don't buy into Trump's chaos. This is about protecting our immigrant communities, not destruction of our city.
So reinforcing her view.
Yeah.
This is political, it's counterproductive, and the real focus should be supporting the people impacted by the initial raids.
Exactly. Now, moving up to the state level, Governor Gavin Newsom's reaction was just as immediate, just as forceful, especially about federalizing the National Guard.
You didn't waste any time, did he?
No. He called the federalization illegal and unconstitutional. right off the bat, described it as reckless and immoral, and he unequivocally stated that President Trump had manufactured a crisis.
So same core message as the mayor, but adding that strong legal challenge, illegal and unconstitutional.
And California didn't just stop at strong words. The state took major action, filing a lawsuit against the Trump administration.
A lawsuit. Okay, what was the basis for that?
The suit specifically accuses the president of unlawfully federalizing the state's National Guard. The legal argument, as reported, is that the deployment exceeded federal authority and, crucially, violated the 10th Amendment.
The 10th Amendment, reserving powers to the states.
Right. The state's filing called the federal action an unprecedented usurpation of state powers. It's a direct legal challenge to the president's authority in this specific context.
And then when the Marines were deployed, how did Newsom react to that?
Equally strong. He announced plans to sue to stop that deployment, too. He called it illegally deploying them onto American streets, labeled it a blatant abuse of power, and said it crossed a red line.
A red line.
Yeah. And he stressed that Marines are not political pawns, implying they were being used improperly for political theater rather than any legitimate military function.
It's also interesting what the sources say about the LAPD chief's perspective.
Yes, the head of the Los Angeles Police Department. He was reportedly surprised by the Marine deployment. Surprised. And he expressed concern that it could actually make things harder for his own officers, the local law enforcement, who are already managing the situation on the ground.
That's significant. It suggests the federal military intervention wasn't necessarily welcomed or even seen as helpful by the city's own police leadership.
It definitely paints a picture of a pretty unified front, doesn't it? You've got the mayor calling it a political test case that created chaos. You've got the governor filing lawsuits calling it illegal and a usurpation of state power. And even the city's police chief is expressing surprise and concern.
Yeah, it looks like local and state leadership were strongly pushing back, framing the federal actions as a political overreach, not a necessary response to a genuine local crisis.
And that really robust pushback immediately throws the legal and constitutional dimensions into sharp focus. This isn't just political posturing. It's a high-stakes battle testing the very boundaries of executive power and these long-standing rules about using the military inside the U.S.
Exactly. Let's talk about those rules. The central legal principle here is the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. What does that actually do?
So Posse Comitatus, in simple terms, generally prohibits using the federal military Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force to perform domestic law enforcement tasks within the United States.
Why? What's the idea behind it?
The core idea is to keep a clear separation between the military, which is trained for combat and national defense, and civilian law enforcement, which handles enforcing laws within the country. It's seen as a fundamental safeguard against using the military to suppress domestic dissent or enforce laws against civilians, a check on potential military overreach domestically.
Okay, so deploying Marines in LA seems like it would fly right in the face of that act. But you mentioned exceptions earlier.
Yes, there are exceptions. The most well-known is the Insurrection Act. It's an old law dating back to 1807, and it grants the president authority to deploy the military domestically under very specific circumstances. Things like suppressing insurrections, domestic violence, or conspiracies that obstruct federal or state laws or deprive people of their constitutional rights. Usually, it's invoked when state authorities are considered unable or unwilling to handle the situation themselves. It's the legal tool presidents have occasionally used, historically, for federal troop deployment domestically.
So given the talk of protests, unrest, maybe even the administration calling it a form of rebellion, you'd expect the president to explicitly invoke the Insurrection Act to justify sending in thousands of troops and Marines, right?
Yeah, you might expect that, yeah. But here's a really crucial detail from the sources. President Trump did not explicitly invoke the main Insurrection Act in his order for this LA deployment.
He didn't. So what did he cite?
That's key. He cited a different, more specific provision of the U.S. Code Section 252 of Title 10. Now, this section is part of the same chapter of laws related to the Insurrection Act, but it's slightly different. It authorizes the president to use the militia or the armed forces.
Which includes the Guard when federalized.
Right, but whether it clearly applies to active duty forces like the Marines for purely domestic enforcement is debated. But it allows using them to suppress a rebellion or to execute the laws of the United States when regular forces are insufficient.
Okay, so a different legal hook. How did the administration justify using that specific section for what was happening in LA?
Well, the order framed the situation by stating that the protests or acts of violence hindering the execution of federal laws, presumably the ICE enforcement, constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States.
A form of rebellion, so not a full insurrection declaration under the main act, but labeling it this way to fit Section 252.
That seems to be the interpretation, yes. Using that phrasing to bring the situation under the umbrella of that specific statute, bypassing a formal Insurrection Act declaration.
This is where the analysis from legal experts, like those in the Politico piece, becomes really important. How do they react to this legal basis?
They were highly critical. The experts quoted in the sources pretty much slammed the justification. They used words like flimsy, contrived, pretextual,
Pretextual
meaning the stated reason isn't the real reason. Their assessment was that the legal rationale seemed weak, almost purpose-built to justify a decision that was, in their view, largely motivated by politics.
largely motivated by politics. That echoes Mayor Bass's test case concern again. What did the experts think the political motivation was?
They worried the real goal here, especially doing this in a state like California, known for resisting federal policies.
The so-called blue state.
Exactly. They feared the purpose was to assert federal power over states challenging administration policies, particularly on immigration. Kind of a show of force demonstrating federal authority in jurisdictions led by political opponents.
And beyond the immediate politics, did they see dangers in this approach?
Oh, absolutely. Serious concerns. They worried the deployment itself, especially putting active duty Marines into a domestic crowd situation, could actually inflame tensions, make things worse.
Yeah.
They talked about a potential vicious cycle. The military presence leads to more intense clashes with protesters, right? Which the administration could then point to as justification to finally invoke the full Insurrection Act and deploy active duty forces even more aggressively, maybe even more widely.
So, using this initial deployment, maybe based on a flimsy pretext, to potentially create the conditions for an even bigger, more legally grounded deployment later.
That was the fear expressed by some experts, yes. A dangerous step that could pave the way for more severe actions. Rosa Brooks, a law professor cited, called it flatly a political stunt and a dangerous one.
A dangerous stunt.
Yeah, and she also pointed out something important. The actual laws in this area, the precise boundaries between federal and state authority, how you interpret these statutes, it's all somewhat unsettled and untested. This situation and the lawsuits could really set new precedents.
And Elizabeth Goitein, another expert.
Even more direct. She called the situation dangerous for liberty, dangerous for democracy. She hit on that fundamental point. Military forces clashing with protesters on American streets is not supposed to happen.
There was also a specific worry about what the troops would actually do, right? Beyond just guarding buildings.
Yes, that was a key question raised. Would the Guard and Marines just stay put, guarding those two federal buildings Mayor Bass mentioned? Or would they potentially start accompanying ICE agents out into neighborhoods, actively participating in or providing security for immigration arrests away from federal property?
Because that would be a huge step further.
A massive step. If federal military personnel are actively involved in domestic law enforcement away from federal property, that raises much deeper questions about presidential authority under these laws and really dials up the civil liberties concerns.
Now, you said deploying Marines like this is rare, but using federal troops domestically, sometimes even over a governor's objection, that has happened before in U.S. history, hasn't it?
Yes, it's not entirely without precedent, and the sources mention a couple of key historical examples. President Lyndon Johnson deploying federal troops in Alabama in '65 during the Selma civil rights marches, overriding Governor Wallace, and President Eisenhower in '57 sending the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce school desegregation against Governor Faubus's resistance.
So there are times, historically, where federal power and the military were used to enforce federal law or constitutional rights against state resistance.
Correct. And you have legal scholars like John Yoo, who worked in the George W. Bush administration, arguing that such steps can be justified. His perspective is basically presidents might need to act if governors are tragically slow, like maybe during Hurricane Katrina, or if they're actually resistant to federal law, citing desegregation and implying this LA situation might fit that mold from the federal viewpoint.
So different legal philosophies on when this kind of extraordinary action is okay.
Definitely conflicting interpretations. And it's worth remembering that brief episode after Hurricane Katrina. There was a debate then about presidential power to deploy the Guard without state consent. Congress actually passed something in 2007 giving the president that power during disasters or insurrections.
But that didn't last, did it?
No, it faced huge backlash, interestingly, from basically all 50 state governors, Republicans, and Democrats. They saw it as federal overreach. So Congress repealed it in 2008, putting the law back closer to where it was, generally requiring state consent or that specific justification, like enforcing federal law against state obstruction.
So even recently, there was a push for a more federal power here, and then a quick pullback. Shows how sensitive this issue is.
Extremely sensitive. And against that whole backdrop, the unsettled law, the historical precedents, the recent debates, California's lawsuit isn't just procedural. The sources frame it as a high-stakes courtroom test of Trump's efforts to expand executive power and assert federal dominance over states. The outcome could echo far beyond L.A.
Okay, let's recap the legal picture quickly. The administration used a specific, maybe less common, legal provision to justify sending troops and Marines, not the main Insurrection Act.
Right, claiming a form of rebellion.
Legal experts are calling that justification flimsy, possibly pretextual, and politically motivated.
Major concerns about it being a power grab against resistant states and potentially escalating things.
And California is hitting back hard with lawsuits, arguing it's an unconstitutional violation of state sovereignty under the 10th Amendment.
Setting up a major legal battle over federalism and presidential power.
Okay. Let's step away from the high-level legal and political fights for a minute. The sources also give us a sense of what it actually looked like on the ground during these protests, right, in L.A. and elsewhere.
Yeah, they paint a picture, especially outside that federal building in downtown L.A. where things got intense. Reports describe police trying to push back crowds of protesters.
And the tactics used. The sources mention police declaring an unlawful gathering.
Standard procedure when they want crowds to disperse.
And when they didn't, police used less lethal rounds and pepper balls.
And crucially, the reports noted these weren't just fired from ground level. They were also coming from the building top.
From the roof, implying personnel inside or on the federal building were firing down on protesters below.
That's what the reporting suggests, yeah. Which adds another layer to the confrontation. And several arrests were made during these clashes.
And these protests weren't just in L.A., were they? This reaction spread.
No, definitely not isolated. Sources mention similar demonstrations popping up in cities across the country, Austin, San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia, all reacting to the ICE actions and the federal deployment.
Any details from those other cities?
A few. In Austin, Texas, protesters marched to the ICE processing center. Some apparently occupied the federal building there for a time, also leading to arrests. Signs seen there included things like, "No human being is illegal."
Reflecting that core issue driving the protests.
Exactly. And in San Francisco, there was a march down Mission Street, chants against ICE like, "Move ICE, get out the bay." And interestingly, the sources noted some protesters wearing Palestinian keffiyehs.
Suggesting connections being drawn to broader struggles.
It seems so. For some participants, the fight against ICE and federal authority seemed linked to wider themes of perceived oppression or resistance, drawing parallels, perhaps, with situations like the one in Gaza.
Beyond the crowds and police actions, the sources also highlight specific individuals caught up in this.
Yes, and these personal accounts really bring the human cost into focus. One really striking story is David Huerta. He's the 58-year-old president of CU California, a major union.
And he was arrested.
Violently arrested, according to the reports, while acting as a community observer during an IC raid. Not protesting, but observing.
Observing. And charged with conspiracy to impede an officer. That seems serious for an observer.
It does. He was released later on $50,000 bond. But after his release, he talked about hoping his actions hadn't put union members in harm's way. And he highlighted something critical he saw while detained. Inmates couldn't access lawyers or attend court because the facility was on lockdown.
Pointing to bigger systemic issues within the detention process itself.
Exactly. Then there's the incident with the Australian journalist Lauren Tomasi.
Right. She was hit by a non-lethal round while covering the LA protests.
Yeah, sustained an injury. She later posted online saying she was okay, but emphasized it made her more determined to keep on telling the stories.
And that got international attention.
It did. The Australian government reportedly contacted the U.S. about it, calling the images horrific. It just underscores how using force against protesters and journalists covering them can have international repercussions.
And finally, there was that moment at the BET Awards.
Yeah, the Black Entertainment Television Awards happened to be in L.A. during all this, and the rapper Doechii, used her acceptance speech to talk about it directly.
What did she say?
She called the federal deployment ruthless attacks creating fear and chaos. She asked, basically, what kind of government deploys the military whenever people protest? And she explicitly linked it to broader struggles, speaking up for Black people, Latino people, trans people, people in Gaza, a very public condemnation, tying the LA situation into a global narrative of resistance.
So these individual stories, the union leader arrested while observing, the injured journalist, the artist speaking out, they give us that vital ground-level view. It's a stark contrast to the abstract legal debates, showing the real human impact.
Definitely. Which leads us right back into the intense political friction simmering underneath all this. That showdown between President Trump and Governor Newsom is a huge part of the narrative in these sources.
Newsom, particularly, seemed to be framing this as something much bigger than just a policy fight. He called it an unmistakable step toward authoritarianism.
Yeah, he consistently used language like authoritarian tendencies, command and control, power, ego to describe Trump's motivations, painting it as part of a pattern, a leader trying to grab power, not solve a problem.
And the sources suggest Newsom, seen as a potential future Democratic leader, might also see a political opportunity here.
Well, he's described as a presumed frontrunner for Democratic leadership post-Biden, and the suggestion is he seems to be relishing his chance for a public showdown with Trump.
Political strategists quoted certainly saw it that way.
Yeah, one called it a potential gift for the governor, a chance to showcase stark differences with Trump, especially in California where Trump isn't popular, suggesting Newsom's defiance plays well with Democrats desperate for a fighter.
So, boosting his national profile as the face of resistance.
That's one take. Another strategist echoed that, saying Newsom is trying to use this moment to elevate his national profile.
But that strategist also offered a warning for Newsom, didn't he?
He did. Charlie Collian warned that if the standoff drags on or if there's significant violence or destruction associated with the protests, public sympathy could shift. Newsom could be damaged if voters see him as siding with, criminals over security forces. He pointed out that voters overwhelmingly want law and order, which is a theme Trump often emphasizes.
And Trump himself wasn't pulling any punches against Newsom.
Not at all. Sharp personal attacks, called Newsom weak, accused him of doing nothing to protect LA from what Trump called violent riots, claimed he warned Newsom beforehand, you've got to take care of this, otherwise I'm sending in the troops.
Painting it as necessary federal intervention because the state failed.
Exactly. And then there was that truly wild exchange about potentially arresting state officials. Tom Homan, the administration's border czar,
He threatened to arrest Newsom and Mayor Bass.
publicly threatened to arrest anyone obstructing immigration enforcement, naming them specifically.
And Trump's reaction.
When asked about Homan's threat, Trump said, I would do it if I were Tom. I think it's great.
Wow. Endorsing the arrest of a sitting governor and mayor.
It's extraordinary language. Homan apparently walked back his comments slightly later, but the president's public endorsement speaks volumes about the animosity and the stakes.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem also weighed in with some strong claims.
Yes, she asserted the protests were absolutely organized and paid for, called them an operation professionally done.
But the sources note she offered no evidence for this claim.
Correct. The reporting specified she made the claims without providing evidence at the time.
She also attacked Mayor Bass personally.
Called her a train wreck of a mayor. And in that stark contrast we mentioned, while Bass calls LA a city of immigrants, Noam called it a city of criminals. Just highlighting the completely opposing narratives.
This wasn't just a California versus Trump thing, though. Other Democratic governors got involved.
They did. They issued a joint letter calling Trump's National Guard deployment an alarming abuse of power. So the concerns about federal overreach were definitely resonating in other state capitals.
And finally, a warning from veterans groups.
Yeah, they voiced concerns that using the military this way, in a charged domestic political situation, risks turning the military itself into a political tool, undermining that principle of a non-political military separate from domestic disputes.
So you've got this intense political layer over everything, leaders trading barbs, serious threats being made, strategists analyzing the angles. It's clearly as much a political power struggle as anything else.
Absolutely.
And just before we wrap up, there's one last detail from the sources that adds another wrinkle, connecting this to surveillance and policing.
Right. The mention that software used for surveilling immigrants has deep ties to the LAPD.
What does that suggest in the context of everything else?
Well, it hints that even while city and state leaders are fiercely pushing back against federal actions like raids and military deployment,
The visible stuff.
exactly, there might be underlying connections, maybe technological dependencies between federal immigration surveillance efforts and the city's own police department. Deep ties implies significant interaction, maybe data sharing, using the same tools, that sort of thing.
So the public narrative is state-local resistance versus federal overreach. But this detail suggests the lines might be blurrier on a practical technological level, especially when it comes to monitoring immigrants.
It complicates the picture, yeah. Even if city leaders resist raids, parts of the local police infrastructure might already be integrated with or reliant on federal systems used for tracking people. It raises questions about how embedded these federal tools are, even in a self-proclaimed city of immigrants.
It's a crucial reminder that these dynamics are rarely simple. There can be these hidden connections operating beneath the surface of the big political fights, potentially impacting the very communities leaders say they're protecting.
Definitely adds another layer to think about regarding authority, power, and how federal and local systems interact, especially around immigration.
Okay, so we've really walked through a rapidly escalating situation here in Los Angeles. We saw how initial ICE actions spiraled into this major confrontation. You had conflicting levels of government clashing, major legal challenges being thrown down, and this highly unusual domestic deployment of federal military forces, including Marines.
Yeah, we heard Mayor Bass framing her city as a test case for federal power grabs, and Governor Newsom launching lawsuits calling the federal moves illegal, unconstitutional, and unprecedented usurpation of state authority.
And on the other side, the Trump administration justifying it all by citing the danger of rebellion, while also launching sharp political attacks against California's leadership.
And the legal experts we looked at, they really questioned the administration's legal basis, highlighted the political motivations, and warned about serious risks, potential escalation, dangers to civil liberties, setting worrying precedents.
And woven through it all were those voices from the ground, the fear residents felt, the police tactics, the arrests, the injuries, the protests spreading, even that moment at the BT Awards. It paints such a vivid human picture of the real impact.
Absolutely. It goes beyond just the headlines.
It really leaves you grappling with some big questions, doesn't it? What happens when the federal government decides a state's handling of protests requires military intervention, especially against the express wishes and judgment of local leaders? And what does it mean when the legal justification for that move is so heavily disputed?
It forces you to re-examine these fundamental pillars of the U.S. system, that balance between federal and state power, the real limits on presidential authority, and what the military's role should actually be within our own borders.
And here's something for you, the listener, to really mull over as we close. As these federal and state powers clash so dramatically, and the lines between protest, unrest, and this loaded term rebellion get debated in the context of military deployment, how does a moment like this shape the future? The future of civil dissent, the future of how government responds to it here in the U.S.
Yeah, when that line between civilian life and a military presence on domestic streets starts to blur, what are the long-term consequences? For civil liberties, sure, but also just for that fundamental relationship between citizens and their government. It's a lot to think about.